Hello, good evening, welcome back to iconic teen fiction with me, clearly not a teenager. So we all have comfort books, right? Or we all have those books that we've been reading for so long that we basically don't need the book anymore and we can recite the story in our heads. Well, one of the books that I'm going to be talking about today is like that for me. And I found it really interesting reading it this time with my English head on and realizing that it was kind of really problematic. So this should be fun. The author I'm going to be talking about today is Jandy Nelson, who wrote The Sky is Everywhere and I'll Give You the Sun, two of the most lyrically beautiful books that I have ever read in my entire life. Talk about The Sky is Everywhere first, not just because that's the order I read them in and that's the order they came out in, but because this is the one that I read when I was a teenager and absolutely loved and adored, and read it literally once a month, and then I haven't read it for ages. Now I came back to it and I really wanted to analyse what I loved so much about this book, and I have my conclusions on it, but they are not what you might think. The Sky is Everywhere is about a girl called Lenny whose sister Bailey has just died suddenly and tragically. They weren't expecting it at all. She has to come to terms with her sister's death while also simultaneously growing up and falling in love for the first time, and it's something that she finds really hard. The reason it was really interesting reading this with a new perspective, trying to put it across to somebody else, is because Lenny is kind of a dick, and I've seen reviews that have called Lenny a dick before and just thought nothing of it, because there's always somebody who thinks the protagonist of a YA romance-ish novel is a dick. But now I can kind of see where they're coming from. The reason for this is that although Len has met this new guy, Joe, and he's really amazing and they're really well suited to each other and they have this really cute romance going on, she starts snogging, essentially, her dead sister's boyfriend. So yeah, that's something you don't see every day. I think that the thing I really loved about this book the first time I read it, I think I was about 16, 17, and it's the first time that I really understood death and grief, and that's possibly because at the time, and this is a really shit comparison, I was going through my first real breakup, and although it's nothing like losing a family member at all, there is grief involved, right? There is a loss involved. So it is comparable in a small way. And this comparison is actually made in the book, but we'll get onto that later. So the big, dramatic, sad prose in this book, really spoke to me on an inner level because I was feeling really teenage angsty about my breakup. A lot of different types of loss are explored in this book, it's not just death. Obviously, eventually, spoiler alert, Joe eventually finds out that Lenny has been seeing Toby and they obviously split up. And so she experiences this whole new grief and this whole new loss of losing a person but having them still be around and having them choose not to be around you anymore. It's a whole different kettle of fish. Also, Lenny is raised by a not very typical family unit. It's her grandmother, who she calls Gram, and her uncle Big. Her mother, ran out on them when she was, 1, and she's never seen her since, and her gran has always said, oh, she'll come back one day. As kids, Lenny and Bailey, her sister, always, just believed her, but now that she's older, she's kind of starting to question that. And at the end of the book, there's this big reveal about her mum, and there's an exploration of another kind of loss in Graham, in that, she told her daughter, who was about to run out on the kids, that if she did run out, she could never come back. And so Graham kind of blames herself for the fact that these kids haven't had a mother. It all sounds really dramatic when I'm talking about it right now. I feel like this was not the place to start. It's actually a really lovely book. One of my notes at the end about both books is that for books about such deep and dark subject matter, they've got such a romantic and lovely prose. It's amazing. Got a bit distracted. Let's keep to the notes. The book is also about growing up. It's kind of a coming of age story as well. And so we explore a little bit about relationships and how they change as we grow up. Lenny's relationship with Bailey changes, even though Bailey has gone, because Lenny finds out secrets that her sister was keeping from her, and she has like this anger she feels toward her sister that she feels like she can't have, because obviously Bailey's dead and you're not supposed to think ill of the dead and stuff like that. Lenny's relationship with her mother changes, even though her mother isn't in the picture, because once there's this big reveal about her, Graham starts to tell her more stuff about her, and her mum becomes like a real solid person in her mind instead of this fantasy figure that Graham had always been trying to make her into. Even her relationships with Graham and Big change slightly, although this crazy family unit is kind of like a comic relief situation from the rest of the book. In the book, they talk about this thing called the restless gene that runs through their family. And, you know, it's a little bit of a feminist commentary, I'm not gonna lie. Essentially, some of the women in their family just randomly get this urge to run away for years and just Sagittarius it off into the wilderness, and then they wander back after a couple of decades and everybody's like, oh, it's fine, it's just something that runs in the family, you know. They talk about how if it happens to a man, it's not that unusual, but obviously because these people are women and, you know, they have kids and then just move on and don't particularly care about the kids, it's weird. But the point that I am trying to make, aside from this feminist rhetoric that I am again spouting, is that Lenny considers what members of her family might have possibly had this gene and why this might have influenced the decisions that they made. I think the relationship that's explored the most thoroughly in this book is definitely Lenny's relationship with herself. She is learning to experience the world without her older sister Bailey, who had this much more outgoing personality, as her like filter for experiences. She felt like she could just fade into the background and not have to be this big personality because Bailey was there to do everything for her. She was only kind of a risk taker if Bailey was to say, oh, come on, Lan, let's do it. And then she felt brave enough to do it because Bailey was there beside her. Now she doesn't have Bailey as that parachute, and it affects her in a big way. She says she feels like a companion pony, which is like the little ponies that racehorses have to keep them company or whatever, I don't know. She basically feels like a side character in life. And, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be a side character in life, but everybody should be able to do the things that they want to do. And because of this side character role that Lenny has always taken, she doesn't feel like she can reach out and grab these opportunities, so she like throws her first chair audition for the clarinet that she plays, and she doesn't think that she can have a relationship with the gorgeous new boy because who is she really? Throughout the book, Lenny definitely learns a lot of things about herself, and she comes to really explore her full personality in a way that she really couldn't before. And I'm not saying that Bailey dying was a good thing in any way, shape or form. Bailey dying was the catalyst for Lenny growing up and being herself, and maybe if Bailey hadn't died, this would have happened a lot later in life. It was good that they had this more universal theme of like growing up and getting to know yourself. Obviously, there's only a certain amount of young adults who can relate to the theme of losing a sibling. It was just good to have this more universally relatable content. One thing about this whole theme that I really like is there's this motif where Lenny keeps referring back to the fact that she needs a new alphabet, and I think that's great because sometimes growing up is about relearning everything that you thought you knew. And so it's like the alphabet is like the most basic thing that we first learn as kids, right? Lenny has to go back and relearn even that just to carry on in her life after this has happened to her. It just really encapsulates like this feeling of she's completely changed as a person. And there's also, right at the beginning, there's like this houseplant that everybody believes follows the trajectory of her life. It's sick, and they're trying to save this houseplant throughout the course of the book. At the end of the book, Lenny obviously realizes that the houseplant isn't her anymore because she's not the girl that she used to be, and she goes and throws it in the waterfall or whatever. There's a lot of really great symbolism in these books, and it all comes back to this really gorgeous poetic language that Nelson has. And obviously I think she was a poet before she published these books, so she's got a lot of experience writing like that, and so her writing will be a lot more wishy-washy and emotional and woo-woo. But I like wishy-washy and emotional and woo-woo, okay? That's why I think even with the dodgy love triangle, which we're going to talk about in a sec, this book was so beloved by me as a teenager because the language in it is just so gorgeous. I'm gonna compare another book to Lolita right now. The concept of Lolita, it's so perfect to explain things for other books, but like, you know how reading Lolita is such a lovely experience because Humbert Humbert is so great with language. It's like that, and I feel like the gorgeous language of this book made me overlook some of the other weirder aspects of it in my youth, such as the primary love interest, Joe Fontaine. I absolutely loved him growing up. I thought he was great. Now I think he's a little bit two-dimensional, not fully, like he is flawed and stuff, but I think, I don't know, he's just on the wrong side of too perfect for me. I don't know. Plus they have this whole conversation about Lenny's virginity where Joe's like, oh, it'd be cool if you let me have it, and I'm like, that is not a romantic conversation, my guy. I don't know, that little bit was weird for me and it always weirded me out, but it's something that you can overlook. Some people might find it cute, I don't know. Let me know if you found that cute, if you read this book. I think if I was to compare Joe to another YA love interest, it would definitely be Gus Waters, although I definitely hate Joe less. But I loved both of them as a teenager, so take from that what you will. I appreciate the fact that the romance in this book is not insta-love. It's this sweet, dorky little romance that like blossoms at a semi-natural pace. You can genuinely believe that the teenagers in this are two teenagers who are naturally attracted to each other and get on and have things in common, etc, etc. The romance with her sister's boyfriend does kind of come out of nowhere, but it's obviously meant to be a grief sex thing. Lenny is never supposed to have a solid, explainable reason for why this happens, and it is something that does happen in real life, surprisingly often. So, I guess good representation. It's actually very short-lived, and there's not as much focus on this love triangle throughout the book as some people might like you to believe. I think that my one real gripe with the love triangle is once Joe finds out and, you know, he dumps Lenny and then he doesn't want to speak to her and he tries to go out with this other girl who's been set up as Lenny's rival throughout the book. Like, it almost feels like we're supposed to feel like Joe is a dick. And like, it's even described as like unforgiving dickhead him on several occasions by Joe as well. Even though it's explainable and understandable, I guess, that Lenny has done this thing, like, he's still allowed to be mad, right? He's still allowed to maybe not forgive her if he doesn't want to. Like, we don't have to see Joe as a dick. There are kind of some attempts for Lenny to have some self-reflection and be like, oh, I did do this bad thing to him and he didn't deserve it and he shouldn't forgive me because I'm a bad person, but the general feel of the text is that Joe should just forgive Lenny straight away. We shouldn't have to get down on our knees and beg him for forgiveness because we were sad, okay? I think even though I don't enjoy this book as much as I did when I was younger, it's still a really gorgeous read, and even though it's not as much of a love story as even I might have advertised it as when I was younger, the reason that I think it's described that way so often is because the language in itself is romantic, right? We're talking about roses, we're talking about gardens, we're talking about music, we're talking about weddings all the time. It's generally a book about love, but not necessarily like a romance novel, right? Love and death, the perfect combo, what can I say? The second book we're going to be talking about is I'll Give You the Sun, and this is the book that I enjoy the better of the two now. The plot follows Noah and Jude, who are twins. Half of the story is told from Noah's perspective when the twins are 13, and the other half of the story is told from Jude's perspective when they are 16. Something awful has happened in between, and there are a lot of mysteries that are revealed to us slowly throughout the course of the plot. One of the things that's really interesting about this book is that the narrative switches are equally interesting. Like, usually if there's two characters narrating a book, you relate to one or enjoy reading one more than the other. In this book, I find Noah and Jude both equally engaging, and depending on at what point in my life I'm reading it, sometimes I relate more to Jude and sometimes I relate more to Noah. And the two of them have their own switches and mad personality changes as well. So there's this like really well-roundedness and like 3D-ness to the characters that I really enjoy in this book. Noah, for example, in this book, who is artsy and weird and introverted, and he sets his whole life and his whole gaze on getting into this exclusive art school, and when that doesn't happen, he just switches off and becomes everything that he once hated: sporty, unartistic, popular, and also straight, but we'll get into that later. Because this story spans a few years, and it's the years when these characters are growing up and discovering themselves, it allows us to explore even more sides to their personality. Because I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I did go to these kind of extremes in an effort to discover myself or whatever. Also, the narrative switch where we found out that Noah had turned into an artichoke, as Jude would say, was really heartbreaking, because Noah was like this prodigy in art, just this really unique soul, and to find out that he had like conformed and started acting like everybody else, it was like this really what the fuck moment. My only gripe with the narrative perspective switches is I would have really liked to see the ending of this book from Noah's perspective, because Noah does obviously get a love story that only ends at the end of the book, and I would have liked to have seen that from his perspective. That would have been great. I understand that would have broken out of the pattern that the book had established so far, but I don't care. I love Noah and Jude as characters. They're both kooky and they have odd beliefs. They're similar enough that you can believe that they're twins and they grew up in the same environment, but they're also different, but it's in similar ways. It's really interesting. The characters are really interesting. Jude says odd things as facts. Like, she's like a bit of a hypochondriac, and she says that people probably have these weird, mad, rare diseases that they probably don't have, and that like things have magical properties like onions and stuff like that that other people don't believe they do. And you know, she says it very matter-of-factly, whereas Noah takes normal things in real life and makes them extraordinary in his head with his paintings, right? So you can see they're different, but they're similar, yeah, and they're both completely wild. Noah also makes sense of the world with his paintings, right? He expresses his emotions through these paintings and how he portrays things within them. Whereas Jude has her grandma's Bible, which is just basically a book full of old wives' tales and witchy wisdom that Jude takes as fact. So they've both got their own unique ways of seeing the world and making sense of it, and they're also both wild. Death is also a really big theme here. Find out that during the gap between narrative switches, their mother has unfortunately died, and it's kind of the same situation as with The Skies Everywhere, because they find things out about their mum that they didn't know before her death, and it changes their relationship with her, and it also changes their relationships with the people around them. There are obviously two love stories throughout this book, one for Noah and one for Jude. Jude's is kind of insta-love, and it is lampshaded in the fact that, oh, my mum predicted you, and like, oh, my Bible predicted you, and it's like, I understand that these are two people who believe in like true love and fate and like split apart and stuff like that. Boy, is that fun to read about. I mean, it is for me, but I really like Jude and Oscar I understand that I have said a million times that I don't like the bad boy trope, and I think that Oscar is a little bit too much of the bad boy trope for me to really like him. But I like Jude, and I can tell through the really gorgeous language that Jude really likes Oscar, so I ship it. Then there's Noah, who is gay, like I mentioned before, and has a will they won't they relationship with this other guy called Brian, and it is the most intense sexual thing I've ever read ever. They don't even kiss until like the book is nearly over, but just like the tension between them and the fact that like the first time I was reading it I was like, does Brian like him? I don't know, but then like as it gets further on you're like, okay, there is definite tension going on here, and it is palpable. Again, Jandy Nelson really knocks it out of the park with the language here. I can feel everything that these twins feel, I'm telling you. I don't know whether I'm just a sucker for really romantic language. Like, I am a Libra, you will have to forgive me. I don't know, Jandy Nelson really does it for me, what can I say? I think that my general Jandy Nelson notes would be that family, and especially siblings, and their relationships are really important to her. That's something that she really likes to explore. I wouldn't be surprised if she has lots of siblings, or maybe just one very special sibling in her life. Like I said before, for stories about death, there's so much life and magic in these stories, and that's definitely one of my favourite things about both these books, is that although it's not like, oh, now we're going to cast a spell and magic's going to happen, there is definitely magic in the worlds of these books. In the Skies Everywhere, Graham's roses are said to cause people to fall in love, and Lenny uses them to get Joe back. Throughout the book, Lenny is writing these poems, which are actually, in my version of the book anyway, represented in like really cute ways. Like here's one on a napkin, and like there's some on trees and some on takeaway cups and stuff like that. See, they're all really nice and really cute. It was one of the reasons that I even looked at the book in the first place. And like, she's writing these poems as a way to kind of like understand her grief for herself. And a lot of these poems end up making their way to Joe, and it kind of factors into a reason why he forgives her in the end, because they allow him to understand the grief that she was feeling and kind of the way that Toby lessened that grief. Toby's Bailey's boyfriend, by the way. I don't know whether I've said that. One thing that I always say about Jandy Nelson books is that they're really, really comparable to John Green books, in that like all the characters are kind of like big and quirky and out there, and the scenarios are far-fetched, and there's this little edge of magic and stuff like that, but she just never got the same recognition as he did. I don't know whether it's because like she just didn't write as many books or whatever, but I feel like, no offense to John Green, but I feel like the writing in these books is so much more, I don't know, like just so much more gorgeous and stuff, and poetic. As well, the scenarios feel a lot more grounded in real life. As much as I've been talking about magic and stuff, like the characters and stuff feel a lot more real. Like they're quirky real instead of quirky bizarre like John Green characters are. And like, this is not me bashing John Green, but I just felt like Jandy deserved kind of the same level of adoration as he did. I don't know. But that is the end of today's episode of Iconic Teen Fiction. If you've enjoyed it, this has been a questionable review, and I'll see you next time.